Picture this. You're looking down at the Persian Gulf from, like, high-resolution satellite imagery, and it's March of 2026.
Right.
Now, normally, this body of water is this incredibly dynamic, constantly moving superhighway of global commerce. I mean, it is the beating heart of the world's energy supply, just pulsing with these massive vessels 24 hours a day.
Yeah, exactly.
But right now, as you look at this satellite feed, it is a parking lot. You have roughly 500 massive oil tankers and another 500 container ships just sitting there.
Wow.
They're completely paralyzed, just idling in the water, dropping anchor wherever they can possibly find space.
It's a surreal image, really.
Right. And why? Because a 21-mile stretch of water, the Strait of Hormuz, has essentially been closed off.
Yeah.
And the most shocking part of this image is, well, it's what you don't see.
Which is the lack of a traditional navy.
Exactly. The strait hasn't been closed by some impenetrable ironclad wall of naval warships lined up bow to stern. If you zoom in on the water itself, there is no massive armada physically blocking the path. It has been closed by a handful of cheap, expendable drones and skyrocketing spreadsheets on the desks of insurance adjusters in London.
Yeah, and that is a profound shift. I mean, it completely subverts our traditional understanding of maritime power.
Because we always picture big ships. Right.
Exactly. For centuries, controlling a choke point meant physically occupying it with overwhelming naval tonnage. But we are looking at a situation today where the physical presence of a navy is almost secondary.
Right.
The enforcement mechanism isn't a wall of steel. It's the psychological and financial terror being inflicted on the global shipping market.
And that is the core mystery we're unpacking today. We're doing a deep dive into the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis. And just to set the geopolitical stage for you really quick, on February 28th, there was a joint U.S. and Israeli military campaign, Operation Epic Fury.
Right, the targeted strikes.
Yeah, strikes against Iranian military facilities and leadership. And this resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. So in the immediate, totally chaotic aftermath of that, Iran retaliated. And the most devastating lever they pulled in that retaliation was the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Which instantly trapped roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply.
20%.
Yeah, along with a massive, just irreplaceable share of global liquefied natural gas, or LNG. I mean, the shock waves through the global economy were instantaneous. We saw Brent crude surpass $100 a barrel almost overnight.
Right.
And it eventually peaked up around $126. I mean, economists are already classifying this as the largest, most structural disruption to the global energy supply since the oil shocks of the 1970s.
Wow. Okay, so to figure out how this bottleneck is actually functioning, and more importantly, how it might be broken, we've gathered a really fascinating stack of sources for this deep dive.
We have some great material today.
Yeah, we're synthesizing intelligence reports from the Joint Maritime Information Center, the JMIC, and the UK Maritime Trade Operations. We're pulling historical maritime data from the 1980s tanker war to see, what history can teach us.
Yeah.
We're also examining the legal frameworks under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and we've got raw shipping and financial data straight from Lloyd's of London.
And providing our main strategic roadmap today, we have this really groundbreaking operational concept paper from the Middle East Forum.
Yes.
Which proposes a comprehensive strategy for reopening the strait, but without requiring some massive conventional ground campaign.
Which nobody wants. So our primary mission today is to completely dismantle the myth of the traditional naval blockade. We're going to explore the anatomy of what is actually happening out there on the water, and then walk through the integrated strategic blueprint that military planners are proposing to break what is, in reality, an insurance blockade.
I love that term.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this concept of the insurance blockade.
Yeah.
Because when I hear the word blockade, my mind is instantly conditioned by history books,
Right, you think of World War II.
Exactly, or the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
I picture a line of heavily armed destroyers pointing massive cannons at anything that dares to cross an invisible line in the ocean.
Sure.
But based on the intelligence reports, if you look at the Strait of Hormuz through a traditional 20th century naval lens, Iran shouldn't be able to enforce a blockade at all right now. I mean, their surface navy has been severely compromised.
Yeah, severely compromised is almost an understatement here.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The coalition airstrikes during the initial waves of Operation Epic Fury, they systematically targeted Iran's traditional naval infrastructure. They took out their aging frigates, they devastated their fast attack craft inventory, and they sank their dedicated mine lane vessels.
Wow.
So from a conventional standpoint, the Iranian Navy just does not possess the large surface combatants required to form that traditional line of steel across a 21-mile gap.
Yet the traffic data tells a completely different story.
Completely different.
Like, if we look at the automatic identification system, the AIS data tracked by Starboard Maritime Intelligence, the drop-off is just staggering. Before the February strikes, the Strait was averaging about 153 large commercial vessel transits every single day.
Right.
Within days of the escalation in early March, that number plummeted to 13.
Just incredible.
And soon after that, we started seeing days where the transit number literally dropped to zero. 0 ships passing through the single most important energy choke point on planet Earth.
What's fascinating here is the disparity between the lack of an Iranian surface fleet and the absolute cessation of commercial traffic. It is the defining characteristic of modern asymmetric warfare.
Because they aren't using ships to stop ships.
Exactly. The closure is not being enforced by frigates. It's being enforced by an atmosphere of unpredictable asymmetric fear. By mid-March, the JMC had confirmed 21 separate attacks on merchant ships.
21. Yeah. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, they understand a fundamental truth about global shipping. They do not need to sink every single ship that tries to pass.
Right.
They only need to demonstrate that making the transit carries a completely unacceptable, unquantifiable level of risk.
And the sources outline some terrifying examples of how they are demonstrating that risk. Like on March 1st, a Palau-flagged oil tanker called the MT Skylight was struck by a projectile. And the crazy thing is, the ship wasn't even engaged in evasive maneuvers. It was at anchor.
Right, just sitting there.
The damage was so severe that the crew had to abandon ship, and tragically, 2 crew members were killed, including the captain.
It's awful.
And then you have the case of the Stena Imperative, which is a U.S.-flagged products tanker. It wasn't anywhere near the 21-mile choke point of the Strait. It was sitting in a dry dock in Bahrain.
Completely immobilized.
Completely immobilized. And it was struck twice by projectiles, causing a massive fire and killing a port worker. And that geographic spread of those attacks is a really vital piece of the IRGC's strategy. I mean, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Advisories are painting a picture of a threat that has metastasized far beyond the Strait of Hormuz itself.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. The danger zone now encompasses the entire Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Intelligence is tracking attacks on vessels conducting ship-to-ship, or STS transfers, way up near Al-Basra in the far north near Iraq.
Oh, wow.
And we are seeing massive container ships, like the Source Blessing, getting hit while stationary north of Jebel Ali in the UAE.
There was also the Sinangal Namibe, right? A massive oil tanker that was hit by a sea drone explosion while anchored near Kuwait. That is more than 500 miles away from the strait.
Yeah.
And it isn't just physical projectiles either. The reports detail severe electronic warfare. Commercial crews are dealing with intense GPS spoofing and AIS anomalies.
The electronic warfare aspect is particularly insidious, actually, because it strips away a commercial crew's ability to trust their own instruments.
How does that actually work in practice?
Well, when a ship's GPS is spoofed, the navigation systems aren't simply jammed or turned off. They are fed false, localized signals that overpower the legitimate satellite timing signals.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Exactly. So the ship's autopilot, believing the false coordinates, might quietly correct course, steering a 300-meter-long vessel directly into shallow waters, or a known minefield, or Iranian territorial waters, all without the crew realizing it until the visual horizon no longer matches their digital charts.
So you have commercial seafarers practically sailing blind, knowing that a cheap, explosive-laden sea drone could just drop out of the sky or skim across the water's surface at any second, and their commercial radar might not even pick it up until it's 100 yards away.
Right.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the core mechanism of the insurance blockade, because shipping companies are rational, profit-driven economic actors.
Yeah.
They aren't militaries.
No, they're businesses.
Exactly. They don't want to lose a multi-million-dollar vessel, and they certainly cannot afford to lose their crews. So before a ship even pulls up its anchor to sail into a high-risk area, the operators rely on war risk insurance.
And that insurance market is highly centralized. The Joint War Committee of the London insurance market essentially functions as the global arbiter of maritime risk.
Okay.
When tensions flare, they draw a red line around specific bodies of water, designating them as high-risk areas. If a ship owner intends to sail a vessel into that red line zone, their standard insurance policy is voided unless they negotiate a specific additional war risk premium.
And the numbers coming out of Lloyd's of London and massive insurance brokers like Marsh are just eye-watering. Like, Lloyd's actually released a statement stressing that they haven't abandoned the region.
Right, they said they're still open for business.
Right. They said, we are still insuring shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. We haven't stopped providing contracts. But the availability of the contract isn't the issue at all. It's the premium attached to it.
Yeah.
Before this conflict kicked off, war risk premiums for transiting the strait hovered around 0.125 to 0.25% of a ship's total hull value.
Pretty standard.
But by the second week of March, that rate had spiked to between 1 and 1.5%.
And it's helpful to break that math down, actually, because a percentage point sounds negligible until you apply it to the astronomical value of maritime assets.
Right.
Let's take a relatively standard mid-sized oil tanker valued at $100 million. A 1.5% war risk premium means the operator must pay an extra $1.5 million in cash up front per voyage just for the privilege of crossing that 21-mile stretch of water.
Which is insane. And when you scale that up to a very large crude carrier, a VLCC, the math becomes totally paralyzing.
Oh, yeah.
A VLCC is essentially the Empire State Building laid on its side, capable of carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil. The hull itself might be valued at over $130 million, and the cargo is worth another $150 to $200 million, depending on the spot price.
Right.
Suddenly, you are talking about millions upon millions of dollars in insurance premiums for a single transit. The profit margin for moving that oil doesn't just shrink, it vaporizes.
And what's fascinating here is the genius, if you can call it that, of the asymmetric insurance blockade. The IRGC never actually has to formally declare the strait closed.
Wow.
Right? The insurance underwriters in London don't even need to officially cancel their policies. The market simply prices the coverage out of existence. Without that financial safety net, the tanker operators absolutely refuse to sail.
And if the tankers don't sail, the oil stays bottled up.
Exactly. A handful of drones, which might cost a few $1,000s each to manufacture, have achieved the exact same strategic outcome as a multi-billion-dollar surface fleet.
That makes perfect economic sense. But the sources point out a fascinating countermove by the U.S. government. On March 6th, Washington announced a massive $20 billion reinsurance facility, specifically designed to cover hull and cargo under the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. They essentially stepped in to backstop the private insurers, basically saying, if the market won't carry the financial risk, the U.S. taxpayer will. My immediate thought reading that was, problem solved. If the U.S. government throws $20 billion on the table to erase the financial risk, why did the ships instantly start moving again?
Well, that intervention really exposes the absolute limit of purely financial solutions in warfare. I mean, a sovereign wealth fund or a superpower's treasury can underwrite the cost of replacing a massive steel hull.
Sure.
They can reimburse the lost revenue of 1 million barrels of crude oil sinking to the bottom of the Gulf. But there is no financial instrument on Earth that can underwrite the psychology of a terrified human crew.
The human bottleneck.
The ultimate bottleneck. Rachel Reeves, the UK Chancellor, held an emergency meeting with the chair of Lloyd's of London, Sir Charles Roxburgh. And coming out of that meeting, the message was stark. The primary obstacle isn't the availability of insurance products or the liquidity to back them.
It's the people.
It is the immovable obstacle of the physical safety of the captains and the seafarers. You mentioned the casualty reports earlier. Commercial seafarers, largely from nations like India, the Philippines, and Indonesia, are finding themselves on the front lines of a geopolitical war they have absolutely nothing to do with.
The story of the Musafa, too, really drives that home for me.
Yeah.
He was a commercial tugboat, completely unarmed, just trying to assist another vessel that had been damaged.
Right.
It was struck by 2 missiles and sank. 3 of its crew members simply vanished into the sea. Imagine being a 24-year-old deckhand from Mumbai, making a modest commercial wage, and you're being asked to sail a slow, lumbering, highly explosive gas carrier through waters where tugboats are being blown to pieces while trying to mount rescue
Yeah,
operations.
so the Indian government actually reached a point where they proposed deploying their own naval assets strictly to safeguard the estimated 23,000 Indian crew members who are stranded on various ships idling in the region.
23,000.
Yes, because a massive shipping conglomerate in Geneva or Singapore, they can absorb the financial risk if the U.S. government is backing them up.
Right.
But the captain, standing on the bridge, staring out at waters filled with drifting sea mines, dealing with spoofed navigation screens, and waiting for a drone to drop out of the clouds, that captain is operating on the primal instinct of self-preservation. If the crews walk off the job, the ships don't move. The blockade is ultimately enforced by human fear.
So we have the mechanical reality established. It is an insurance blockade enforced by irregular drone strikes and human terror. But how does international law even process this? Because if you look at the foundational text of maritime law, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, what Iran is doing seems blatantly illegal.
Oh, the legal framework governing this crisis is incredibly complex, and it is hotly contested. Under UNCLOS, specifically Articles 37 through 44, international straits that connect one part of the high seas or an exclusive economic zone to another, which perfectly describes the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
They are subject to a very specific legal regime known as transit passage.
And transit passage is a very robust right, isn't it? It basically dictates that all ships, whether they are civilian oil tankers or heavily armed military warships, have the unencumbered right to continuous and expeditious transit through the strait.
Crucially, that right of transit passage cannot be suspended by the coastal states bordering the strait.
So Iran to the north and Oman to the south.
Exactly. Even during times of heightened geopolitical tension, security crises, or outright armed conflict, transit passage remains inviolable. In legal terms, it is considered a lex specialis, which is a specific and specialized legal regime that overrides general rules of maritime sovereignty.
But according to the research published in the RSIS International Journal, Iran is operating on a completely different legal interpretation. They claim that the Strait of Hormuz should be governed by the more restrictive concept of innocent passage, rather than transit passage.
Right.
And furthermore, they're heavily leaning on the justification of self-defense following the U.S. and Israeli strikes on February 28th.
Yeah, Tehran's argument is that Operation Epic Fury constituted an unlawful act of aggression against their sovereign territory and their head of state.
Okay.
Therefore, they argue they are legally entitled under international law to take proportional countermeasures, which they claim includes securing their territorial waters and closing the strait to vessels belonging to hostile nations or those carrying cargo that aids those hostile nations.
But the international community overwhelmingly rejects that premise, right?
Right.
I mean, even if a nation views the initial military strikes as unlawful, the global consensus on UNCLOS is that you simply cannot suspend transit passage. It is the absolute bedrock of global maritime navigation.
Absolutely.
If nations could arbitrarily close international choke points every time they felt threatened, global trade would collapse overnight. I was actually trying to conceptualize how this legal standoff feels in practice. It reminds me of a mafia protection racket.
Okay, how so?
Well, imagine you own a busy restaurant on a public street. A rival mob boss doesn't actually barricade your front door or put a padlock on your business. Instead, he just has a dozen heavily armed enforcers stand on the public sidewalk right across the street, glaring at anyone who walks by.
Right.
They haven't actually shot a customer today. They claim they are just standing on a public sidewalk exercising their rights. But the implied threat is so massive, so palpable, that absolutely nobody is going to walk into your restaurant.
That perfectly illustrates what maritime strategists refer to as the sliding scale of disruption. Iran has mastered the art of operating within this highly ambiguous legal gray zone.
Yeah.
They rely heavily on hybrid threats to maintain a veneer of plausible deniability. They avoid taking the formal, legally unambiguous step of declaring a traditional naval blockade, which would be a clear act of war under international law.
Right.
Instead, they utilize non-state proxy actors, they deploy untraceable, uncrewed surface vessels, and they utilize electronic jamming.
Because operating in that gray zone paralyzes the international response.
Yeah.
I mean, if they lined up frigates, the coalition could just shoot the frigates. But how do you legally and militarily combat a swarm of anonymous drones and GPS spoofing?
This raises an important question about how our current international legal frameworks are just failing. I mean, UNCLOS was finalized in 1982. It is fundamentally a 20th century framework built around clear definitions of state actors, traditional piracy, and recognizable warships.
Right, big gray boats.
Yeah. It is conceptually ill-equipped to address 21st century hybrid drone warfare, where a non-state proxy group operating out of a coastal cave can launch a cheap suicide drone that severely damages a $150 million commercial vessel, all while the sponsoring state officially denies any direct involvement.
And the sources bring up the Corfu Channel case of 1949 as a historical precedent for these kinds of legal battles over straits.
Yeah, the Corfu Channel case is a foundational ruling from the International Court of Justice. It involved British warships striking naval mines in Albanian territorial waters. The ruling essentially reaffirmed that warships possess the right of innocent passage through international straits in times of peace without needing prior authorization from the coastal state, and it established that a state is responsible for unlawful acts occurring within its waters if it know about them.
But the fact that international lawyers are forced to cite a case from 1949 involving physical naval mines in the Mediterranean to try and resolve a 2026 crisis involving AI-guided sea drones and spoofed satellite signals in the Persian Gulf, that just proves how deeply outpaced the law is by modern technology.
Oh, completely. And as the RSIS paper astutely notes, even if Iran attempts to justify its actions as targeted countermeasures against the U.S. and Israel, the reality of their disruption constitutes an indirect wrongful act against the entire world.
Right.
The collateral damage harms third-party neutral nations, countries across Asia, Europe, and South America who rely desperately on the uninterrupted flow of that oil and LNG.
So if we strip away the massive political fallout of the Khamenei assassination for a moment, and we look at this strictly as an operational math problem, the Middle East Forum paper gives us a cold, calculated look at how to break this bottleneck.
Yes, the 5 lines of effort.
Right. They argue that waiting for diplomatic breakthroughs or International Court of Justice rulings isn't going to get the oil flowing. The global economy will suffocate first. The challenge is, how do you forcibly reopen a strait that has been closed by fear and insurance premiums without triggering a massive D-Day-style conventional ground invasion of Iran?
Well, the Middle East Forum operational paper proposes a highly integrated strategy comprised of 5 mutually reinforcing tactical approaches. The first of these focuses entirely on the water, continued air, and naval attrition.
So breaking down the current state of that attrition, the coalition forces, led primarily by the U.S. and its allies, haven't just been sitting on their hands. They've been aggressively degrading Iranian military assets. The intelligence reports indicate they destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying ships in a single coordinated operation. They've decimated functional missile battery components along the coast. General Dan Kane, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually went on record stating that every known company involved in building components for Iran's ballistic missile program has been functionally defeated.
Yeah.
Yet despite all of that firepower, the strait remains empty.
Because the calculus of an insurance blockade is incredibly unforgiving. You can wipe out 95% of the IRGC's coastal infrastructure, but if that remaining 5% consists of a few mobile drone launchers and a handful of fast attack boats hiding in coastal inlets...
The premiums stay high.
Exactly. The insurance premiums will remain sky high. However, the military planners understand that absolute eradication isn't the requirement.
It's risk management, not absolute risk elimination.
Yeah, exactly that. The coalition does not need to eliminate every single theoretical threat. They only need to degrade the threat architecture below the specific mathematical threshold at which the London insurance markets are willing to price coverage at a reasonable, commercially viable rate.
And the military doctrine required to achieve that confidence is very specific. The sources quote the doctrine as, "Route clearance must precede escort, not follow it." To understand why that doctrine is essentially written in blood, the historical data takes us back to the 1980s, to the tanker war between Iran and Iraq.
The tanker war, which raged from roughly 1981 to 1988, is the essential historical textbook for analyzing the 2026 crisis.
Why is that?
Well, during that protracted conflict, both Iran and Iraq initiated a strategy of attacking neutral merchant vessels in the Persian Gulf. The goal was to choke off each other's oil revenue. Iraq actually initiated the Maritime phase, hoping that by attacking Iranian oil infrastructure, Iran would retaliate by closing the Strait of Hormuz.
Which would force everyone else to get involved.
Exactly, forcing foreign powers to intervene and stop the war.
And Iraq's gamble worked. By 1987, The situation was so dire that the U.S. military intervened with Operation Earnest Will. This is the largest naval convoy escort operation the world had seen since the end of World War II.
Yeah.
Kuwait actually asked the U.S. to reflag their massive oil tankers with American flags, effectively placing them under the protection of the U.S. military so U.S. warships could legally escort them through the Gulf. But the launch of that operation was an absolute disaster, wasn't it?
Oh, the Bridgerton incident is a masterclass in the dangers of escorting without clearing. In July of 1987, the U.S. Navy organized the very first Earnest Will convoy. The centerpiece was the Bridgerton, a truly massive supertanker heavily laden with oil.
Right.
The Navy surrounded this floating behemoth with 3 formidable warships, a cruiser, a guided missile destroyer, and a frigate. It looked like an impenetrable bubble of American naval power.
But there was a fatal flaw in the Armada. Those 3 high-tech warships did not possess dedicated minesweeping capabilities. They were designed to shoot down aircraft and sink other ships, not hunt for submerged explosive. And Iranian intelligence was well aware of this blind spot. So, as this massive, heavily armed convoy steamed through the Gulf, the Bridgerton struck a massive, submerged Iranian naval mine.
The explosion was catastrophic in its force. However, because the Bridgerton was a supertanker, meaning its hull was incredibly thick, double-layered in places, and heavily compartmentalized to store millions of gallons of liquid, it absorbed the blast. It was severely damaged, but it didn't sink.
But the irony of what happened next is just wild. Following the explosion, the commanders of the 3 U.S. warships realized that their own hulls were incredibly thin compared to the supertanker. If a cruiser or destroyer hit one of those mines, it would likely be torn in half and sink, with massive loss of life. So the 3 warships, the vessels that were explicitly sent there to protect the tanker, had to frantically maneuver to line up in single file behind the crippled Bridgerton. They followed in its wake, using the massive civilian oil tanker as a heavily armored shield to clear the rest of the minefield.
It's wild. The visual of the protectors cowering behind the protected was a profound humiliation, and it immediately halted the operation. Admiral William J. Crowe, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, ordered all convoy operations to cease until the military could deploy proper mine countermeasure platforms to the Gulf.
Wow.
Hence the ironclad doctrine we see in the 2026 operational papers. Route clearance must precede escort. You cannot simply build a shield of destroyers around a commercial ship and blindly sail it into a contested choke point. You have to meticulously sweep and sanitize the route first.
Which brings us to a highly classified parallel operation from the 1980s that the sources highlight, Operation Prime Chance. Because the Navy realized they couldn't just sweep mines defensively, they had to stop the Iranians from dropping them in the water in the first place.
Prime Chance is one of the most fascinating special operations in naval history. The U.S. military understood they needed a persistent, aggressive presence in the northern Persian Gulf, but they didn't have bases close enough, so they essentially created their own islands.
I love this part.
They leased 2 massive civilian oil industry barges, towed them into the Gulf near Farsi Island, and converted them into highly classified mobile sea bases.
They just parked these massive barges in the middle of the ocean and loaded them up with Army Special Operations helicopters, Navy SEALs, and explosive ordnance disposal teams.
Correct. And from those floating bases, they conducted aggressive, low-light, proactive patrols. They hunted the mine layers.
Wow.
The climax of the operation occurred when U.S. forces actually caught an Iranian amphibious landing ship, the Iran Azur, red-handed in the dead of night, physically dropping naval mines into the shipping lanes. They captured the ship, documented the mines, and completely stripped Tehran of its plausible deniability on the world stage.
So if we take that 1980s history and apply it to the 2026 crisis, how has the technology evolved? I imagine the U.S. military isn't going out and renting civilian oil barges from private companies anymore.
No. The concept of the mobile sea base has evolved dramatically. Today, the U.S. Fifth Fleet operates purpose-built behemoths for exactly this kind of asymmetric environment. Vessels like the USS Lewis B. Puller and Expeditionary Sea Base. It is a massive, highly adaptable floating staging area that can launch special operations forces, deploy advanced mine countermeasure assets, and launch swarms of small interception boats. It is the direct, highly engineered evolutionary descendant of those 1987 barges.
And the tools they're deploying from the Puller have totally shifted the math. In the 80s, they were relying on guys leaning out of helicopters with night vision goggles trying to spot wakes in the water.
Right.
Today, the operational papers highlight the use of UUV's unmanned underwater vehicles. These are autonomous submarines that can map the seafloor with high-resolution sonar, identifying anomalies that look like mines. You have autonomous surface vessels continuously patrolling for drone signatures.
The technological leap is immense, but the core strategic principle mirrors the Battle of the Atlantic during World War II, specifically the treacherous convoy routes to Murmansk.
How so?
Well, the Allied navies never sank every single German U-boat in the ocean. That was an impossible task. But by deploying a layered defense continuous air cover, aggressive close escorts, and highly sophisticated intelligence-driven routing, they managed the threat.
Right.
The turning point was known as Black May in 1943, when the Allies began destroying U-boats faster than the German shipyards could build new ones.
And that is the exact goal of the naval attrition strategy in 2026. The coalition doesn't need to find every single drone hidden in a cave in Iran. They just need to degrade the IRGC's coastal launch capabilities and sink their FATH boats faster than Tehran can replace them, suppressing the threat just enough that the actuaries at Lloyd's of London feel comfortable dropping the war risk premiums.
Exactly.
Okay, so if that intensive naval combat represents the effort on the water, the Middle East Forum paper introduces a geographic pivot that absolutely blew my mind. Because while the coalition navies are fighting the drones in the Gulf, the next tactical approach focuses entirely on the land. We are talking about the littoral diversion, and specifically the Awazi Arab insurgency.
This is arguably the most strategically brilliant and historically underdiscussed element of the entire crisis.
I had never even heard of it.
Most people haven't. When the general public, or even casual geopolitical observers, think of Iran, they tend to view it as a monolithic, ethnically homogeneous Persian state. But if you look at the demographic and geographic map of Iran's extensive coastline, a very different, highly fractured reality emerges. The province that dominates the critical northwestern shore of the Persian Gulf is Khuzestan.
And Khuzestan is fundamentally different from the rest of Iran. It is home to a population of roughly 3 to 4 million Awazi Arabs.
Exactly. And the Awazi Arab population has a deeply complex and painful history with the central government in Tehran.
Right.
For over a century, dating back to the centralization efforts of the 1920s, this population has faced documented systemic marginalization. Human rights groups have extensively detailed the cultural suppression, the economic disenfranchisement, and the severe environmental degradation of the region's water sources, like the Karun River, which has devastated local agriculture. But the tension is explosive because of one undeniable geologic fact. Khuzestan province contains over 90% of Iran's entire onshore oil production capacity.
90% of the wealth of the entire nation is sitting under the feet of a population that the central government actively marginalizes. That is a recipe for insurgency.
It is the ultimate Achilles heel of the Iranian regime. And for over 2 decades, heavily armed militant groups within this population have been actively rebelling against Tehran.
Like ASMLA.
Right, the Arab struggle movement for the liberation of Awaz. They have waged a low-intensity, persistent guerrilla war. They have a documented history of targeting IRGC patrols, sabotaging major oil pipelines in the Zarqan area, and launching attacks on the massive maroon oil field infrastructure.
The central regime is obviously terrified of this internal threat. I mean, the intelligence sources note that between late 2024 and early 2025, just before the current crisis erupted, IRGC intelligence units were conducting sweeping mass raids across Khuzestan, arresting dozens of Awazi activists and organizers.
Yeah.
Tehran was terrified that these local grievances would converge with the broader national protest movements that periodically sweep across Iran.
And according to recent intelligence reports from outlets like Israel Hayom and JNS, since the decapitation strikes of Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, that convergence has essentially arrived.
The insurgency is active again?
Highly active.
Right.
There are credible reports that American and allied intelligence officials have been actively holding clandestine talks with Arab opposition groups in Khuzestan, alongside Kurdish and Baluch opposition leaders in other border regions.
Wow.
The insurgency has flared into open conflict. Groups calling themselves the Awaz Falcons are conducting coordinated raids on isolated IRGC bases, and the Ahaz Freedom Brigades have effectively declared open rebellion in the province.
When I first read about this, I struggled to connect the dots. I could figure out how funding an insurgency on land actually opens a shipping lane on the water.
It seems disconnected at first.
Right, but then the geography of it clicked. Iran's coastline is massive, roughly 1,500 kilometers from the Iraqi border, all the way down to Pakistan. The Strait of Hormuz itself is located far to the south in Hormozgan province. But the lifeblood of the country, the massive Abadan refinery, which processes 400,000 barrels a day, and the critical Kar Island oil export terminal is all the way up north in Khuzestan province.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it creates an impossible logistical double bind for the IRGC.
Yes.
The Revolutionary Guard does not possess infinite manpower or infinite resources. They simply cannot simultaneously suppress a heavily armed, highly motivated, and newly resourced domestic uprising, threatening their most vital oil infrastructure in Khuzestan, and maintain the dense, highly coordinated coastal surveillance grids, drone launch sites, and fast boat patrols required down south in Hormuzgan to effectively terrorize commercial shipping in the strait.
It is a deliberate strategy to stretch their bandwidth to the breaking point. Every single IRGC battalion that has to be deployed to Khuzestan to stop Avazi rebels from blowing up a pumping station is a battalion that cannot be used to coordinate a sea drone attack in the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
Every surveillance drone searching the marshes for insurgents is a drone not spotting oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman.
By heavily incentivizing this literal diversion, the coalition systematically degrades Iran's shore-based threat architecture without having to drop a single bomb themselves, and it forces the regime in Tehran to make a zero-sum choice.
Right.
If they ignore the insurgency to focus all their energy on maintaining the blockade in the strait, they risk losing physical control of the very oil infrastructure that makes the Strait of Hormuz valuable to them in the first place.
What strategic good is controlling the maritime choke point if insurgents have completely destroyed the Abadan refinery and the Kar Island terminal that pumped the oil into the ships?
The strategic logic of that is undeniably brilliant. It completely flanks the Iranian defense, but it also feels like playing with fire. It absolutely is.
I mean, if we look at the history of the Middle East, what are the long-term risks of the international community leaning on and potentially arming a violent internal insurgency just to solve an immediate shipping crisis? That feels like opening a geopolitical Pandora's box that could plunge the entire region into a chaotic, multi-decade civil war.
That is the grim reality of the calculus, and it speaks volumes about the absolute desperation of the global energy market. You are entirely correct. The historical precedent for funding proxy insurgencies often ends in protracted regional instability, blowback, and humanitarian suffering.
Right.
However, if you confine the analysis strictly to the immediate operational goal of breaking the maritime blockade, the brutal efficiency of the strategy is undeniable. The coalition forces do not have the political will or the resources to launch a full-scale ground invasion of Iran to clear the coastline. But if the IRGC is forced to fight a desperate, resource-intensive war on its own soil against its own marginalized populations, it provides the exact necessary diversion to make the waters just safe enough to execute the next phase of the plan.
Which brings us to the physical movement of the ships. So the waters are being swept for mines, the IRGC is distracted by a raging insurgency in Khuzestan, and the drones are being hunted from the air. But you still have over 300 massive commercial vessels anchored out there waiting to move.
Right.
And this is where the Middle East Forum paper introduces the concept of a modern earnest will. Now, if we look back at the original Operation Earnest Will in the 1980s, the U.S. Navy had the luxury of mass. The intelligence sources point out that in 1987, the U.S. surface fleet boasted 268 surface combatants.
Yes.
They had the sheer numbers to physically escort massive convoys across the entire 500-mile length of the Persian Gulf, from the ports of Kuwait all the way out into the Arabian Sea.
But the mathematical reality of 2026 makes replicating that 1980s playbook entirely impossible. Today, the U.S. Navy surface fleet has shrunk to roughly 111 surface combatants, and those ships are stretched incredibly thin across global commitments in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and elsewhere.
You just can't get enough ships there.
No, you simply cannot pull enough destroyers and cruisers into the Persian Gulf to run 500-mile escort missions for a backlog of 300 highly vulnerable commercial ships.
Jeff Curry from the Carlyle Group gave a quote to The Economist that really puts the absurdity of that idea into perspective. He noted that if you factor in the operational costs, the fuel, the wear and tear, and the logistical tail of deploying a multi-billion-dollar Aegis destroyer to run a 500-mile escort for a single mid-sized commercial cargo ship,
Right.
the actual financial cost of the military protection could easily exceed the total market value of the cargo it is trying to protect.
Exactly.
So if we mathematically cannot do a 500-mile escort, it seems the only way this operation works is if we radically shrink the geography of the protection zone.
That is the exact conceptual leap the military planners have made. The modern solution is the implementation of defended corridors. Instead of attempting to dilute their limited naval assets by escorting individual ships or small convoys from port to port across the entire expanse of the Gulf, the coalition forces concentrate all of their available naval firepower exclusively on the geographical choke point itself.
This is straight.
Yes, the 21-mile-wide S-curve of the Strait of Hormuz.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I was trying to visualize how this functions operationally, and the best parallel I could think of is the security architecture of a major international airport.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. When you take a commercial flight, the TSA does not assign a personal, heavily armed security guard to meet you at your house, ride with you in your Uber, walk you through the terminal, sit next to you on the airplane for 6 hours, and then escort you to your hotel.
No, that would require an impossible number of guards.
Exactly. Instead, the security apparatus heavily fortifies one specific unavoidable choke point: the metal detectors and the baggage scanners. Every single passenger filters through that highly concentrated, intensely scrutinized zone. Once you are cleared through that narrow corridor, you disperse into the wider terminal and board your flight, where the assumed threat level is vastly lower.
That is an exceptionally accurate analogy. Operationally, the coalition establishes a heavily defended, highly sanitized corridor right through the most dangerous waters of the strait. The commercial vessels, the tankers, and the container ships are ordered to marshal together in massive staging areas in the relatively safer waters of the Gulfs of Oman or the deeper Persian Gulf.
Okay.
Once a massive convoy is assembled, they execute a heavily guarded 40-mile sprint through the defended corridor. You have advanced mine-clearing UUVs and surface vessels leading the vanguard. You have guided missile destroyers aggressively flanking the convoy, their Aegis combat systems tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously.
It's like a heavily armed bubble.
Exactly. You have continuous, overlapping combat air patrols overhead. It is a dense, impenetrable bubble of protection. But once the convoy completes that 40-mile sprint and emerges into the wider expanse of the sea, the heavy escorts break off and the commercial ships disperse to their various destination ports independently. It reduces an impossible 500-mile escort nightmare down to a highly controlled, brutally efficient 40-mile sprint.
But even condensing the zone to 40 miles requires an immense concentration of naval assets. The U.S. Navy simply cannot source enough hulls to maintain that corridor 247 on its own. The sources are very clear that this has to be a multilateral effort, pulling in nations that historically might not cooperate militarily.
The diplomatic pressure to build this coalition is immense. Former President Trump publicly demanded the formation of a massive naval coalition, explicitly calling out nations like China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK to contribute assets. While hammering out the public diplomacy of a joint task force is notoriously difficult, the operational frameworks already exist. The Combined Maritime Forces, specifically Task Force 152, already operates in the Gulf and provides a command structure.
And we are seeing other countries step up.
We are already seeing European powers step up. France, through Operation Aspides, has pledged to send advanced frigates, stipulating that their mission is strictly defensive escort, not offensive strikes against Iranian soil. The Indian Navy, recognizing the threat to their seafarers and their energy supply, is deploying significant assets under Operation Sankalp.
And the economic pressure on the Asian nations to contribute to this corridor is overwhelming. If you look at the macro data, Wikipedia's aggregate numbers note that in 2024, a staggering 84% of all the crude oil shipped through the Strait of Hormuz was destined for Asian markets.
84%.
Yeah. Japan relies on the Middle East for 95% of its crude oil imports, almost all of which must transit Hormuz. South Korea's dependency is nearly identical. For those nations, contributing a destroyer to a defended corridor isn't a geopolitical favor to Washington. It is a matter of absolute national survival.
Absolutely.
Well, I have to play devil's advocate here regarding the physical risk of this 40-mile sprint. Andreas Krieg, a prominent security analyst from King's College London, raised a massive red flag about the asymmetry of this warfare. He warned about the inherent danger of placing incredibly expensive, highly advanced military vessels directly in the path of incredibly cheap, expendable projectiles.
That's a valid concern.
What happens during one of these dense convoys if a multi-billion-dollar American or French destroyer, a ship with hundreds of sailors aboard, is severely damaged or worse, sunk by a swarm of $2,000 fiberglass sea drones packed with explosives? The political fallout in Washington or Paris would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
The public might demand withdrawal.
That asymmetrical risk is the nightmare scenario for every naval commander involved. And it highlights why the Middle East Forum paper insists that these tactical approaches must be deeply integrated. You absolutely cannot implement the defended corridor strategy until the air attrition and the littoral diversion in Khuzestan have successfully degraded the IRGC's
Oh,
capabilities.
I see.
If you arrogantly send a billion-dollar destroyer into that 21-mile gap without relentlessly bombing the coastal drone sites from the air, and without utilizing the Avazi insurgency to stretch the IRGC's attention to the breaking point on land, you are essentially sailing into a pre-sighted kill box.
Right.
The defended corridor only works. The risk only becomes mathematically acceptable because the enemy's ability to overwhelm that corridor has been systematically dismantled by the other strategic efforts beforehand.
Okay, so let's assume the corridor works. The navies hold the line, and the convoys start making that 40-mile sprint. The problem is one of volume. Moving massive ships in highly coordinated, slow-moving convoys is an agonizingly slow process. The flow of oil coming out of the Gulf is going to be a mere trickle compared to the 20 million barrels a day that usually rushed through the Strait before the war.
True.
If we're bleeding millions of barrels of oil capacity every single day because the traffic is moving at a crawl, how long until the global economy just snaps? The factories stop, the power grids fail, and the political will of the coalition completely collapses.
That is the ticking clock that defines this entire crisis, and it brings us to a strategic reality that was planned out decades before Operation Epic Fury ever took place: the bypass architecture.
Tell me about that.
The major oil-producing states of the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates in particular, have understood for half a century that their absolute reliance on the Strait of Hormuz was a fatal strategic vulnerability. They knew that a single geopolitical miscalculation could bottle up their entire economy.
Yeah.
So over the last 40 years, they didn't just worry about it. They spent billions of dollars building massive physical insurance policies buried in the sand.
We are talking about the desert pipelines.
Yep.
Precisely. They engineered massive cross-country pipelines designed specifically to bypass the Persian Gulf entirely, allowing them to pump their crude oil directly to alternative bodies of water that Iran cannot control.
The geographic scale of these projects is incredible. The sources detail the two most critical arteries. First, you have Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, widely known as Petroline. This is a monumental piece of engineering.
Right.
It runs roughly 750 miles, starting from their massive Abqaiq oil processing center in the east, cutting straight across the harsh expanse of the Arabian desert and terminating at the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Because it empties into the Red Sea, ships loading that oil never have to go anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz. Petroline has an estimated capacity of about 5 to 7 million barrels per day.
Wow.
Then you have the UAE's contribution, the AD Copa, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline. This one is shorter, running about 248 miles from the Habshan onshore field, cutting through the treacherous Hajar Mountains and emptying out at the port of Fujairah. Fujairah sits squarely on the Gulf of Oman, physically outside and south of the Strait of Hormuz choke point. That pipeline handles roughly 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day.
They are magnificent feats of strategic foresight. But if we run the brutal math of global energy demand, the limitation of this bypass architecture becomes painfully obvious.
Because it's just not enough oil.
Exactly. Under normal peacetime conditions, the Strait of Hormuz facilitates the transit of roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products every single day. If you max out the capacity of Petroline and you max out the capacity of AD Cop, you are looking at a combined flow of perhaps 8 or 9 million barrels per day, successfully bypassing the blockade.
Which means you still have a gaping 10 million barrel per day hole in the global energy market. The pipelines are running red hot, but the world is still short 10 million barrels every single day.
Which means the bypass pipelines do not, and mathematically cannot, solve the blockade on their own. Their strategic purpose is not to replace the strait. Their purpose is to buy the coalition time.
To keep things running.
Right. They provide just enough baseline crude flow to prevent the immediate catastrophic collapse of the global economy. They keep the lights on in major cities, they keep the critical supply chains moving, and most importantly, they sustain the political will of the allied nations while their navies do the hard, agonizingly slow work of clearing the strait.
The operational paper makes a historical comparison here that is absolutely perfect. They compare the bypass pipelines to the Berlin airlift of 1948.
Oh, yes.
When the Soviet Union aggressively blockaded all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, attempting to starve the city into submission, the Western Allies faced a horrific choice. They could roll armored divisions through the Soviet barricades and instantly trigger World War III, or they could surrender the city.
Right.
Instead, they chose a third option, a massive, relentless logistical miracle known as the Berlin Airlift. At the absolute peak of the operation, an Allied cargo plane was landing in West Berlin every 90 seconds, delivering coal, food, and medicine.
The strategic genius of the Berlin airlift was not that it violently broke the Soviet blockade. It rendered the blockade strategically irrelevant by outlasting it. The Soviets possessed the anti-aircraft weaponry to shoot down those slow, unarmed cargo planes at any moment. But the political and military cost of doing so was unacceptably high.
Yeah.
The bypass architecture, these massive pipelines pumping oil to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman, serves the exact same psychological and economic function in 2026. They send a clear, undeniable message to the leadership in Tehran. Your blockade is painful, but it cannot starve the global economy into quick submission. We can survive this longer than you can.
And the coalition's pulling every other lever available to buy even more time. The New York Times reported unprecedented, coordinated moves with global strategic reserves. World leaders rapidly agreed to release a staggering 400 million barrels of stockpiled oil onto the open market.
Right.
Japan's domestic refiners are desperately lobbying their government to tap into the national strategic reserves. The United States is heavily drawing down its strategic petroleum reserve.
It fundamentally shifts the nature of the conflict from a quick, decisive geopolitical shock into a grueling war of economic attrition. The global coalition can absorb a closure of the strait measured in weeks by relying heavily on the bypass pipelines, draining strategic reserves, and enforcing severe demand management and rationing.
But not months.
No, they absolutely cannot absorb a closure measured in months or years. The ultimate dynamic is a race. It is a race between the coalition's ability to slowly bleed out its carefully hoarded oil reserves to maintain public and political resolve versus the total depletion of Iran's internal resources.
Which brings us to perhaps the most fascinating and ironic dynamic of this entire geopolitical crisis, the self-defeating nature of the blockade itself. We've talked extensively about the pain Iran is inflicting on the world, but what is actually happening inside Iran while they are playing this massive game of global chicken?
The irony of Iran's strategy is profound and arguably self-destructive. By effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz to punish the global economy and exact revenge for the death of their supreme leader, the regime in Tehran has simultaneously severed its own economic jugular.
Because Iran relies on the Strait of Hormuz just as much, if not more, than the nations they are trying to punish.
Yes.
The geographical reality is inescapable. The sources point out that Bandar Abbas, which is by far Iran's most critical primary commercial port, sits geographically directly on the Strait of Hormuz. That single port complex handles an estimated 85% of all container traffic entering the country.
And contrary to popular perception, Iran is heavily, desperately dependent on maritime imports for basic national survival. They possess massive underground reserves of unrefined crude oil, yes.
Right.
But due to decades of crippling international sanctions, rampant corruption, and systemic underinvestment in their own domestic refining capacity, Iran actually has to import roughly 30% of its refined gasoline just to keep its domestic vehicles running. Furthermore, they are not agriculturally self-sufficient. They import roughly 40% of their critical wheat supply. So, when the IRGC shuts down the strait by seeding it with drones, drifting mines, and exorbitant insurance premiums, they don't just trap the world's oil inside the Gulf. They trap their own essential supply chains outside of it. The container ships carrying the wheat, the medicine, and the refined gasoline cannot reach Bandar Abbas.
The economic fallout cascading through the Iranian domestic market is staggering to read about. The Iranian rial, which was already incredibly weak, went into absolute freefall, hitting an exchange rate of 1.75 million rials to a single US dollar. The hyperinflation is destroying whatever savings the middle class had left.
It's devastating.
And the human cost is immediate. Reports are filtering out that pharmacies across major Iranian cities are facing critical shortages of life-saving supplies, insulin, advanced blood pressure medications, basic antibiotics. Even the regime's own internal economic advisors were reportedly leaking warnings to diaspora media outlets, stating bluntly that the country was weeks away from a systemic humanitarian crisis if the ports didn't reopen.
To contextualize this massive strategic blunder, military scholars often invoke the classic maritime theory of Alfred Thayer Mahan. In his foundational late 19th century work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Mahan argued that the true ultimate purpose of sea power is commercial.
Okay.
It is the ability of a nation to utilize the ocean for massive wealth creation and supply chain resilience, while simultaneously possessing the naval strength to deny that use to an enemy during wartime.
But the IRGC's execution of the insurance blockade fundamentally violates Mahan's theory. Iran isn't just denying the use of the sea to their enemies. They've created an environment so toxic and unpredictable that they have denied the use of the sea to everyone, including themselves.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a strategy of mutual impoverishment. In a traditional historical blockade, think of the Union Navy blockading the Confederacy during the American Civil War, or the British blockading Germany. The blockading navy sits safely offshore, well supplied, while it slowly starves the target country into submission.
Right.
In this scenario, the blockader is actively starving alongside the blockaded, and the coalition's unstated goal is to explicitly amplify this internal pain. The strategic bet is that in a war of economic attrition, the poorer, more fragile party, which is undeniably Iran, isolated by sanctions and internal dissent, will reach its structural breaking point first.
You have to consider the incredible internal pressure this creates on the leadership of the IRGC. The Revolutionary Guard is a massive, sprawling enterprise. They need constant, massive streams of hard currency revenue to pay their security forces, to fund the Blockade militia that suppresses domestic protests, and to maintain the vast patronage networks that keep the regime's political structure from imploding.
Yeah.
A blockade that bankrupts the blockader is an inherently unsustainable strategy. But looking at the sheer devastation this is causing internally, I keep coming back to a central question. If this strategy is so obviously mathematically suicidal for Iran's economy, why on earth did the IRGC trigger it in the first place? Was it pure, blind, ideological retaliation for the assassination of Khamenei?
Yeah.
Or did they just massively miscalculate how the global insurance market and the allied coalition would actually respond?
Intelligence analysts suggest it is a volatile combination of both factors. In the immediate, highly chaotic days following Operation Epic Fury and the sudden death of their supreme leader, the hardline factions within the IRGC needed to project absolute strength. They needed to exact a toll that the world would notice, both to deter future strikes and to project power to their domestic base. Closing the strait is their ultimate apocalyptic trump card.
Yeah.
However, they likely severely miscalculated the resilience of the global economy. They may have underestimated the capacity of the bypass pipelines, and they almost certainly miscalculated the terrifying speed at which their own domestic economy would unravel once the port of Bandar Abbas ground to a halt.
And we know definitively that the leadership in Tehran is feeling that economic panic because the intelligence reports show them desperately trying to create pressure release valves to save their own economy through selective, desperate diplomacy.
Yes, realizing the catastrophic economic damage of a total closure, Tehran attempted a diplomatic pivot. They publicly declared that they would guarantee safe passage through the strait for vessels belonging to their strategic partners, specifically China and India.
Oh, wow.
They essentially tried to create a two-tier transit system. The strait remains a deadly, closed war zone for ships affiliated with the U.S., Israel, and Europe, but it functions as a safe, open commercial highway for Asian allies.
But the data shows that this diplomatic maneuver was an absolute categorical failure. The transit data published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, showed that even after Iran explicitly gave Beijing the green light, the number of Chinese commercial transits flatlined exactly like everyone else's.
Because the IRGC fundamentally misunderstood the very mechanics of the insurance blockade they had so successfully created. Even if a high-ranking politician in Tehran issues a formal promise of safe passage to a Chinese tanker operator, the ultimate decision-maker is the insurance adjuster sitting at a desk at Lloyd's of London.
They just don't care about the politics.
No, that underwriter is looking at a chaotic war zone filled with drifting, untethered sea mines, hyperactive and decentralized proxy militias who might not get the memo from Tehran, and severe regional GPS jamming. The insurance market does not care about a diplomatic promise of immunity. The mathematical risk profile of the water itself is simply too high.
Right.
So the underwriter refuses to write the policy, the financial backing vanishes, and the Chinese ship operator absolutely refuses to sail.
It actually led to this bizarre, almost comical situation described in the shipping reports. Out of sheer desperation, Random non-Chinese commercial ships started tampering with their AIS transponders to broadcast false Chinese identification data.
It's wild.
You had Greek or Panamanian tankers sailing toward the Gulf broadcasting digital signals that basically said, "Hey, don't shoot, I'm a Chinese vessel," hoping that the IRGC drone operators would see the signal and give them free pass.
Did it work?
No, it didn't work at all. The insurance companies weren't fooled by spoofed transponders, the IRGC wasn't taking chances, and the strait remained empty.
Despite the failure of that two-tier system, China remains the ultimate geopolitical wildcard in resolving this crisis. Prior to the conflict, China was purchasing roughly 1.8 million barrels of heavily discounted Iranian crude oil per day. They are Iran's economic lifeline, providing them with immense structural leverage over Tehran.
And they're feeling the pinch, too.
Exactly. As this crisis drags on, and China's own massive industrial economy begins to suffer from the broader energy shortage and the failure of their immunity status, Beijing's calculus might shift. They possess the unique economic power to act as the ultimate back channel. They have the leverage to quietly approach Tehran and deliver a blunt ultimatum. This blockade is economic suicide for your regime, and it is severely damaging our economy. You have made your point, now you must stand down.
So what does this all mean? When you pull all of these threads together, the complexity of the solution is staggering. We've covered an immense amount of strategic ground today. What the Middle East Forum paper and the intelligence sources demonstrate is that reopening the Gate of Hormuz in 2026 doesn't require storming the beaches of Iran with a massive catastrophic ground invasion.
Right.
The blockade doesn't need to be physically destroyed. It needs to be rendered mathematically and economically irrelevant through the precise, relentless integration of these distinct strategies. You utilize advanced naval and air assets to continuously swat down the drones and sweep the waters, managing the immediate risk.
Exactly.
You leverage the legitimate grievances of the Avazi Arab insurgency in Khuzestan to force the IRGC into a brutal internal two-front war, stripping away their ability to project power over the water. You establish a highly concentrated 40-mile defended corridor, a massive maritime TSA checkpoint to sprint the most vital cargo through the danger zone.
It's all connected.
You rely heavily on the 40-year-old foresight of the bypass pipelines across Saudi Arabia and the UAE to keep the global economy from suffocating. And finally, you allow the crushing, unavoidable weight of Iran's self-inflicted economic isolation to slowly force their leadership to the negotiating table.
It is a profound masterclass in modern asymmetric strategic thinking. The blueprint for surviving this crisis isn't just found in the naval escorts of the 1980s tanker war, and it isn't just found in the logistical endurance of the Berlin airlift. It requires the seamless, simultaneous synthesis of both historical models adapted for the drone age.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, the major takeaway for you listening to this is a total recalibration of how you view global security. Global maritime dominance in the 21st century isn't just about massive gray battleships firing broadside cannons at each other. It's about the cold, calculating algorithms of insurance adjusters in London deciding what risk is acceptable. It's about massive steel pipes buried deep in the Saudi desert decades before you were born. It's about the complex, deeply human calculus of fear felt by a 24-year-old deckhand staring at a spoofed radar screen. The next time you see gas prices suddenly fluctuate at your local pump, you now know exactly how many invisible, highly complex levers are pulling those strings from thousands of miles away.
That is the reality of our hyper-connected world. But I want to leave you with a final, undeniably chilling thought to consider long after we finish today.
Okay, what's that?
If a relatively small number of cheap, expendable drones, combined with the predictable panic of the global insurance market, can successfully paralyze 20% of the world's energy supply, crash the economy of a major nation, and completely rewrite international maritime law in a matter of weeks, what is the logical next step for this kind of warfare? What happens when a highly motivated non-state actor, a terrorist organization, or another rogue nation observes the devastating success of this insurance blockade blueprint and decides to apply it somewhere else? What happens when this exact same asymmetric strategy is unleashed on the Panama Canal or the Strait of Malacca, where a massive portion of the world's manufactured goods must pass?
That's terrifying.
The technology to build these drones is only getting cheaper, faster, and more easily accessible. Are we witnessing a temporary crisis in the Persian Gulf, or are we witnessing the permanent structural end of the freedom of the seas?
Because suddenly, that comforting, precise, orderly vision of a traditional naval blockade where warships line up and uniforms declare the rules of engagement, is completely broken. We are navigating incredibly murky, dangerous waters now. And those 500 massive ships idling helplessly in the Persian Gulf on your satellite feed might just be the very first glimpse of a much darker, much more fragile future for global trade.
Mm.